let's come to the fourth of the presentations on Hermetic America. And a fourth always gives us a frame. And generally, for the mind, a frame is a frame of referential integral. For the differential consciousness, a frame, because it has 5 dimensions in a field of consciousness, reshapes itself as a lens. And it means then that what we are looking through is no longer an integral frame of reference, but is a lens-shaped, 5-dimensional field of possibility. For the last 5,000 years, there has been a double tradition that lensing of conscious possibilities has been called the Hermetic tradition. It has 2 major helical components that are like DNA. They cooperate together, but in a complementarity way. They don't move parallel integrally. They complement an integral and a differential together. The character of that particular structure and dynamic is reflected in the Hermetic tradition. That tradition is based upon reality, not mentality. It's not a socio phenomenon. It is, in fact, a cosmic actuality. So that when we come to something recent, March 12th, 2008, the Daily Galaxy, news from planet Earth and beyond, ancient molecule preserves earliest and most profound events of evolutionary past. The ancient molecule is known as transfer RNA. Transfer RNA reads the sequence of the amino acids that goes to constructing proteins. That sequence is brought to transfer RNA by a different kind of RNA called messenger RNA. It is the combination of messenger RNA and transfer RNA that is able to turn a gene's information in code messaged to the transfer RNA, which is able to construct the proteins. The resolving third in between the messenger RNA and the transfer RNA are enzymes that facilitate this action. The way in which one can easily understand it is that in order to make the protein right, there is a process of adding the message of the recipe to the flour and water to make the bread. The baking of the bread is the refinement of it into food, into nutrition, into a classic bread. The same thing with grapes, turning water into wine. And so bread and wine are not just a traditional communion pair for the transform of the Mass, but they are primordial in terms of civilized human life. But if you are an artist in food, a good chef knows how to add butter to the flour and water, and how to specially knead the butter, flour, and water so that you fold it and refold it and refold it, let it chill, refold it, knead it again, and finally you build up a complex layering so that instead of having bread dough, you now have pastry dough. And when you bake that pastry dough done with a chef's art, you will get a croissant rather than just a bun. If you take the wine from the fermentation and you know how to further distill it, the art of the distiller, you will be able to get a champagne or a cognac. It is the art of transform that is one of the qualities of the Hermetic tradition. How to do this, and how further to understand the art in its exactness as to process and procedure, as to recipe, as to the art of working with it in very special ways. And this is where science comes from. So that the arts and the sciences are different kinds of forms. They are differential conscious forms that are able to influence then in the same way that the visionary field of differential consciousness can transform the phenomenal world of a mental frame of referentiality to things. All of the aspects of the ecology of the cycle of consciousness are part of the Hermetic wisdom of how one does this, raises it to an art by the refinement generally of a critique and a self-critique, leading to the development of an analytic, which is as precise as you are able to expect it. We, by the early 21st century, are able to deal with single photons, single protons, single electrons, and working now on the attosecond level of dealing with single subatomic particles. We have this ability. What we do not have is an understanding of the way in which we got here, informed by a complete Hermetic tradition. And while many parts of the world have been influenced by the Hermetic tradition in its various modes, the most conspicuous history has been that of the United States, because it was specifically the New World that was the greatest lens in the Renaissance. The discovery that there was a New World that was reachable is characterized by Columbus in 1492, because it was the first time that it permanently registered there is a New World. We can go there, but it is a difficult process because that New World is both unknown and very quickly it was discovered it is populated by other human beings. The Renaissance led over a period of a couple of hundred years, from the 1450s up until about the 1650s. It led increasingly to an interchange where the Renaissance, which had evoked a response called the Reformation, which had evoked a counter-revolution called the Anti-Reformation, characterized by the rise of the Jesuit order, by the rise of the authority of the ancient structures of the Roman Catholic and Greek Orthodox and other Orthodox faiths, including Islam, including Judaism, including Hinduism, including Confucianism. All over the world, the authority of social institutions that did not have operative, actively, and consciously within them the great wisdom tradition of the world in any of its manifestations became a subject of conflict and of projection of power. We live in a peculiar time where that projection of power, that conflict, has come into a peculiarity which the Hermetic tradition helps us to understand better than any other perspective. And that is that time has cycles which are phenomenally forms to the mind, to its frame of reference to things, to actions, and that the experience which is generated between the symbolic mind and the ritual actions and their existential things, that horizon of experience then has a peculiar quality. It is subject to the transforms of the mind and the transforms of the rituals. But what has occurred even deeper than, coming back to the RNA, even deeper than that the messenger RNA works with the transfer RNA with a median resolving third of the enzymes, the messenger RNA molecule, which when it is portrayed in terms of its microbiological design, you can see that it is a series of squiggles. If flattened, it looks like a clover. Not quite a 4-leaf clover, but a 5-leaf clover. This form of the 5-leaf clover is the ancient Hermetic star. What happens is that this molecule has messenger RNA, has tags, has riders that are in microbiology now called microRNA, miRNA. MicroRNA are versions and variants to the message that is carried to the transfer RNA. Those microRNA additions, those tagged riders, can also distort the message so that the proteins are not made or that they're mismade. And on the microbiological level, this is the source of disease. It is the source of malnutrition in its deepest, widest sense. It is also one of the metronomes for death. We are poised by 2008 on the curling crest of a time wave, of a time form that cannot be obviated, but it can be ridden through. It can be surfed. The difficulty is that almost nowhere is there an informed Hermetic wisdom understanding any longer available in the magisterial scope in which it belongs, or the art of its presentation, which it merits, much less the analytic, which is possible, which is essential and necessary. In fact, not only essential and quintessential, as in conscious field of vision, but is super essential. Now, that was the way it was talked about 1,500 years ago. The figure who exemplified talking about super essentials was took the nom de plume Dionysius the Areopagite, lived about 500 AD, and was one of the last of the great classical Hermetic philosophers who still spoke and wrote pristine, analytic, and artistic Greek. The recovery, 1,000 years later, of that level of the Hermetic tradition wisdom is what fueled the Florentine Renaissance. And the figure who most properly pivoted that recovery, the rediscovery of that learning, was Ficino, Marsilio Ficino, in Florence. In the early 1980s, wrote a book, Hermetic Roots of America, and its subtitle is Ficino's Renaissance to Franklin's Republic. And it is the detailed, studied academic story of how you went from the Renaissance to the founding of the United States. The subtitle is Ptolemy II Philadelphus to Philadelphia, PA. It is important for us to understand that there is a comprehensive way to make an analytic, to make a lens which is critiquable and refinable to the fine art of the persons involved, and that between the persons who are able to create works which have a noumenal transformative effect, and the scientific forms which are able then to embody this on a level extending out to the cosmos, that the play in between them is the kaleidoscopic process of history. And that history is not a record of an integral experience. It is the spectrum of the range of the possible, so that the emphasis can be recut and shifted so that there is a way to refine both the art and the scientific analytic at the same time. We have been suffering since 2001 from the 9/11 destruction of the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center in New York City. We have for 6 years been involved in what is called the war in Iraq, what has been called the war in Afghanistan. And from a Hermetic America standpoint, they are not wars. They are millennial regressions. They are crusades. They go back to a repetition of what happened 1,000 years ago. They are not wars like the Second World War was a war. And we need to understand that there is a remarkable difference, and that only by coming to understand the range and the spectrum, the tones and the expressions of those differences, will we be able to not only use our intelligence, not only use our sentience of character, of feeling, of imaging, of languaging, but also to access the aspect of the vision the quality of the persons needed, the generation of the history needed to come to an ability to analyze and understand for ourselves not only how to get out of an insoluble problem, but how to transform that problem and its insolubility from the loggerhead to the complementation and generate out of that a future. It is not a question of life and death, it is a question of death and future. And this is a profound thing. One of the great analogs that is brought before us is that the 9/11 is the same kind of challenge for this generation that Pearl Harbor was for its generation. The document that most characterizes the Pearl Harbor challenge was published at Harvard University early in 1942, and this is a copy of it. Graduate School of Public Administration, 1942, Public Policy. A yearbook of the Graduate School of Public Administration, Harvard University, and in it is a series of some of the most intelligent people of the time who are really Hermetic Americans, who understood what was happening. The first of the contributions is by Gordon Allport, who was the great professor of social psychology. His classic book, The Nature of Prejudice, is still recommended reading. He writes, "Overnight, the attack on Pearl Harbor unified the purpose and strengthened the will of the American people. Shortly before that attack, public opinion polls were showing that not more than 30% of the population favored an immediate declaration of war against the Axis powers. Shortly afterward, the returns showed that 97% approved the congressional declarations of war. It went from 30 to 97% in a few days. It is external events that are the great sculptors of the public attitude. By comparison, the agitations of orators, propagandists, and assorted morale committees are relatively ineffectual. The maintaining of national morale during the turbulent months and years that lie ahead is a task with which many public administrators will be directly or indirectly concerned. The Pearl Harbor honeymoon will last a few months at most. Following it comes the need for satisfactory adjustments to the more monotonous stretch that lies ahead." This is the way in which high wisdom was able to characterize the event and tone in terms of a Hermetic America. The major article in this book is by David Reisman, which speaks to the issue that Allport raised. It is one thing for a couple of months to have the shock of Pearl Harbor shifting public opinion 60% in a matter of a few days. It is quite something else to slowly adjust the entire social structure of the country concomitant with the world to a radically different characterization of what is going on every single level, every aspect. One of the primordial changes that one can point to is that comic strips generally were funny pages in the newspaper. After 1941, increasingly comic books were about superheroes. Wonder Woman came out in 1941. You had the rise of Batman. You had the rise of Superman. You had the rise of the Justice League of America, Hawkman and all the rest. And this superhero comic series were published by DC, as in Washington, D.C. Comics. The golden age of superhero comics are DC Comics. The great professor turned public servant in this volume in early 1942 was David Reisman. And he took a look at the real social spectrum of problems that Americans faced, and it's entitled Civil Liberties in a Period of Transition. Now, for the 2000 election, when Al Gore was running against George W. Bush, I excerpted from this essay by David Reisman and sent it to the Gore campaign through some friends. It never reached Al Gore. He was not able to utilize it, nor to receive the characterization which I was able to give at the time. Reisman's first sentence, early 1942, about what lies ahead. In the field of civil liberties, we are ill-prepared for crisis. The same quality happened in 2001, except that the outcome was radically different, because World War II was a crisis of events in the global order, whereas what has happened in the 21st century is a time-form crisis that has to do with the very large rhythms of history. Almost no one understands any longer the need for being able to take a book and to read through the book, not as an integral frame of reference, limited to the horizon of experience in between the symbolic order of the mind and the ritual and existential definiteness of things and their movement. David Reisman's greatest book is called The Lonely Crowd. The Lonely Crowd appeared in 1947 at the end of the Second World War, 5 years after this first volume that I showed you on public policy. It has been reprinted many, many times, and in the 1961 edition, there was a new preface. In the 1968 edition, there was yet a second preference, because the difference between 1961 and 1968 was a radical difference, more radical than the difference between 1947 and 1961, which was already staggering. The difference by 1968 was terrifying. And those of us who were conscious of that era on the university level recognized the profound terrificness of the moment. This edition was published in a new series called the Nota Bene, the Good Notable Books by Yale University, and it was published Yale University Press, 2000. The foreword in 2000 by the editor, Todd Gitlin. In an age that views books as quaint artifacts on the fringes of the entertainment business, we find it hard to recall that books ever guided national conversations in America. Sometimes the impact on history has been direct, and then he goes on from there and to illumine the fact that The Lonely Crowd, followed by its sequel, which was called Individualism Reconsidered, is a direct challenge to a whole school of sociological perspective based especially on a European special limited perspective of the Protestant Reformation and the attendant anti-Reformation of the Catholic Church. And if we come to something like this extraordinary book, this is from 1979, published by the Beacon Press in Boston. The Beacon Press was set up especially for the thinking person to address prominent issues in the current world scene, especially in America. Puritan Boston, Quaker Philadelphia. And in here, the author, E.D. Baltzel, says he is taking a cue from a Polish sociologist who was following a German sociologist named Max Weber. Among the functional prerequisites of social life, it would be difficult not to take social organization into account, writes the Polish sociologist. Social life is group life, and group life involves the inner structuralization of the group. The structuralization consists, among other things, of the emergence of positions of command and subordination, as structure authority is unevenly distributed. For as soon as the positions of authority are filled, those who occupy the positions have the right and duty to give orders, while others have the duty to obey them. Now, this entire structure comes from Max Weber, and I will go into it a little bit after the break. The author says, before proceeding, I should like to briefly discuss Weber's three ideal typical types of authority. 1, the traditional. 2, the bureaucratic. 3, the charismatic. In terms of the Christian tradition, for instance, the Catholic Church tended towards the bureaucratic, in that ultimate authority was vested in a priestly hierarchy, of course headed by the Pope. The sects, because of their egalitarian values, tended towards the charismatic, the evangelical, pietists, Puritans. Congregational Protestantism, especially Puritanism in Massachusetts, tended inadvertently at least towards what I would call traditional or class authority. I use the term class authority interchangeable with traditional authority to suggest that where traditional authority in Weber's sense of the term is strong, class authority tends to reign and vice versa. In New England, Congregationalism was strong because it was intimately bound up with class leadership. When New Englanders moved west, however, they tended to become Presbyterians in their new communities, which had not had time to develop traditions of class leadership. Presbyterianism, of course, was hierarchically organized in a bureaucratic form of presbyters rather than priests, and so forth. David Reisman's sociology is on many dimensions superior to Max Weber. The emphasis is not only that social reality, which is a mental understanding of a structure, but that the group has within it the sense of the individual, of individualism, if you like, and that very often the social realm with a class structure of authority and obedience is utilized almost tool-like by individuals in individualism for their own ends, for their own aggrandizement, and to cooperate with others temporarily as a cabal of like individuals who now are super authoritative, that the bureaucratic structure is subject to the manipulation, and the charismatic appeal is subject to a manipulation, and the traditional authority is subject to a manipulation, which now can be accessed through the command of the population to resources, especially the resource to broaden one's horizons, so that the archetypal war is over education. It is the form of an education that leads to the transform of the frame of reference to a field of vision. Without vision, the people perish. John. Gospel of John. And to pull out of the quintessential five-dimensional conscious space-time a new prismatic form of the person who exceeds on every level the constraints and who encourages on every level the varieties of life, of persons and others' persons, so that one of the most profound books to come out, The Lonely Crowd, is considered by many to be the most influential book of the 20th century. But even more poignant than The Lonely Crowd is Reisman's Constraint and Variety in American Education, first published by the University of Nebraska Press in 1956. The reprint in Anchor Books came out in 1958. It's one of the first books I bought at the University of Wisconsin as a young student. I was 17 at the time. It bowled me over. I was used to thinking that education was in terms of getting your degrees, of graduating, of doing well on tests, not of expanding the horizons of consciousness in order not just to mature who they said you were and who you thought you were and the limitations that you lived within, but that all of it was not manipulable but was improvable. And this is a major watershed between Hermetic America and medieval America, which we face increasingly, and the next decade won't be the decision of how the watershed runs. This speaker, this chair, presents the pioneering advance guard of the penetration of that particular threshold. Let's take a break. Let's come back to the fourth of the presentations of Hermetic America. And in this series, one of the qualities that I'm able to offer is a very long acquaintance in a practical and prismatic way with the Hermetic tradition. When I was a graduate prize teaching assistant at San Francisco State in the summer of 1965, I was suddenly thrust into delivering lectures because the professor that I was apprenticed to, Alvin Fine, was also the rabbi of the largest synagogue in the West Coast because of a Temple Emmanuel in San Francisco. And because of a heart condition, they forced him to retire at 53. And you don't retire a wonderful Portland, Oregon, American rabbi at 53, so he became a professor of humanities. He had a relapse, and I had to take over his courses, graduate courses on Buber, on Maimonides, and undergraduate styles of cultural expressions. Western Civ, as you would say in high school, but raised to a college level. I was successful, and so they rewarded me by saying that you can begin in the spring of 1966 and offer a course. And the course I offered was on the Hermetic Renaissance in Florence. And the pivot of that Hermetic Renaissance was the rediscovery of Plato, and that the core of Plato's dialogues, was that they've refined over a period of about 500 years to the Hermetic dialogues. And that while the Platonic dialogues had a Pythagorean context, Pythagoras, who had studied for over 20 years in Egypt, who had studied over 11 years in the Persian Empire, because Persia dominated Egypt at the time, whose family was not totally Greek, only his mother was Greek. She was a priestess in the northern part of the Aegean, on the island of Samothrace. But his father was a Phoenician trading prince, very wealthy. And the quality of Pythagoras was that he was able to bring the ancient Egyptian understandings of things, the ancient Mesopotamian, Phoenician understandings of things, the ancient Iranian, the Persia of that time revived the old Zarathustra from about 1,500 years before that, so that you had a weaving together with the Greek, the ancient North Semitic, the ancient Egyptian, the ancient Iranian, and so the Pythagorean context of Plato as a context was like a target, and that the lens that allowed for the refinement of the Hermetica, written between 90 and about 110, 120 in Alexandria, that the lens that allowed that to happen was Jesus. So that as the Hermetic Renaissance in Florence progressed, there was the understanding of an ecumenical quality of a great wisdom tradition brought to a focus by the dialogues of Plato through the intermediary of the Pythagorean communities and tradition. And then all of that was effectively resonated for hundreds of years and came to a focus with the greatest teacher that the world has probably ever seen, and that is Jesus, who then lensed prismatically like a jewel the entire wisdom of the planet in such a way that it came back out again in an array which was like a jeweled rainbow. And whereas the ancient natural covenant was of a rainbow, linking heaven and earth with all of its colors, the jeweled rainbow was a scintillation of the quality of a spiritual transform. It's important for us to understand that when it was rediscovered in the Renaissance, they were refined men and women. They progressively discovered that the core of the Platonic Renaissance was the Hermetic Renaissance, and that the pivot of the Hermetic Renaissance was a new pristine looking at Jesus without the filter of Christianity. And because the filter of Christianity was not there, the entire medieval centuries became visioned as a veil which had kept from men, had kept from women, had kept from the koinonia, as it is said in Greek, the community of men and women, the transforming actuality of the presence of God in the teachings of Jesus. And out of this, very quickly, Ficino died in 1499. Within a generation, you had people like Erasmus making their own translation of the Bible from the Greek because he learned to read Greek as good as somebody in ancient times, and learned because the teaching and translating of Plato, especially by Ficino, was so accurate. The translation of the Hermetica by Ficino was so accurate. And finally, towards the end of his life, he translated Plotinus, and then right at the end, he translated Dionysius the Areopagite, the divine names, the mystical theology. And it was one of the listeners of the last of Ficino in Florence. His name was John Colet, C-O-L-E-T. John Colet took that Hermetic Renaissance creme de la creme learning back to England because John Colet became the dean of St. Paul's Cathedral in London. And he started in St. Paul's Cathedral in London, the St. Paul's School, and he wrote a series of 4-volume commentary on Dionysius the Areopagite as the Christian super essence of the quintessence of the Hermetic tradition. One of his closest friends was Erasmus in Rotterdam, across the English Channel in the Netherlands. And one of his closest friends in England was the young Sir Thomas More, who became St. Thomas More. So Thomas More, John Colet, and Erasmus became 3 of the closest friends that took the Hermetic Renaissance out of Florence and jump-started it to London and the Netherlands within 1 generation. When this happened, the Netherlands insight spread into Germany. The English insight spread into Scotland. And before you knew it, there was a tremendous challenge to the nature of the way in which the world had been set up and the fundamental transformation came when the 2 aspects of it came together under Elizabethan England in the person of Shakespeare and the person of John Dee. John Dee was the astrologer to Queen Elizabeth. He was also the greatest mathematician of the day. He is the one who understood for the first time how to have a spherical, analytic, provable and teachable mathematically so that you could navigate on the open oceans of the entire world. And that volume was published in 1575, The Circumnavigation of the Globe. And it was the foundation of the British Empire. It was the foundation of England rules the waves. It is the first truly global empire. The sun never sets on the British Empire. It is the American experience after the Second World War to subsume that particular global control. And that particular global control now has undergone a time-dimensional millennial regression, sea change, in the 21st century. So that we are living in a very peculiar situation that cannot be understood in any kind of normative assessment. All of the triggers, everything that counts, the counters, all of the calibrations are off in terms of normal, integral-only, mental, structured assessments. So that reality is not only not seen, it is not even recognized that it is inexorable, that reality does occur, it is not manipulable, and that we now have incumbent upon us the challenge to make a response which is creative, which involves the multidimensional creativity of the art of person making, not settling just for individualism, and the science of understanding the cosmos, and its proper term is cosmology. That this involves, in making the person, the alchemy as the art of transformation. Not just to make lead out of gold, but how to make a person out of the integral referential frame. And that the person then is not only the center of the frame, but is the resonant space that can be shown with the frame, but exceeds the frame by an infinite context. It is this quality which is very, very difficult for us to appreciate. We talked about last week the tripod upon which the ancient Hermetic tradition stands. It stands on a tripod of alchemy, which is the art of transformation by fermentation. It stands on cosmology, which is the science of distilling what has been fermented. The alchemical term for it was the liqueur. We prefer to use the learned educational grandeur of it. It's the cognac and the champagne. But the third is philosophy, the love of wisdom. And it is in the philosophy, in the love of wisdom, that learning takes place. So that education is not a program. It is not a bureaucratic program. It is not a mental structure of some kind of systematic authority. It is indeed the love and the sharing of the love of wisdom manifesting together the spirit person lensing of each other. The whole point of a dialogue is that there is a regular maturation phase by which this happens. But it cannot even begin until we achieve an ability to be together companionably as friends. Socrates, in many parts of the Platonic dialogues, says we cannot have a dialogue until we learn to be companions together. And very often it's in the doing of the dialogue together that we discover the further dimensions of an expanded horizon where friendship and companionability are shareable and we learn mutually. It is not a question of authority and obedience. It's not a question of a mental assessment on the basis of any ism, any doctrine, any code of laws, any limited integral hierarchy, but it is the ability to go beyond. Now, we talked just before the break about David Reisman, Constraint and Variety in American Education, about how it was published originally, University of Nebraska Press, in a new series 1956, the first in a series, the University Lectures in the Humanities. The reason for this being is that the end of the Second World War, while many new global institutions were being made, like the UN, there was a considered effort to bring together a number of educators from all different areas, every different discipline, and they were brought together, and the conference was on general education. What is it that learning really is about, and what do we need to have as a basic mutual serving dish of learning which can be shared, which leads to this appreciation of each other as friends in maturation. It is not the individual. It is, as Reisman in one of his great books, the sequel to The Lonely Crowd, Individualism Reconsidered. Now, Reisman was particularly placed to understand the practical world in as tough a manner as anyone who has ever assumed a professorial chair. He was originally a biochemist. He graduated from Harvard in biochemistry in 1931. He then became a lawyer. He graduated from Harvard in 1934 as a lawyer. He then became the law clerk to Chief Justice Brandeis in 1935. He became a law professor at SUNY Buffalo and then again at Columbia. He became the Deputy Assistant DA for New York County. He became a member of the Department of Sociology at the College of the University of Chicago in 1946. And of course, after he published The Lonely Crowd, he became the great professor at Harvard, joining at the time in the sociology department the great European founder of sociology, Petrum Sorokin. And Sorokin and Reisman together made the Department of Sociology at Harvard one of the Renaissance-type departments in the world. The quality in The Lonely Crowd that Reisman had pointed out was that we must be wary of misunderstanding on the basis of a mentality only, that he characterized it as there is an outer directed and an inner directed quality that work together, and that any kind of a learning, excuse me, this won't do. This is a meditation. This is not an entertainment. This is not a picnic. A graphic presentation of living in a time when the time form has ended and the new time form does not yet have a response to go with the challenge. Arnold Toynbee, in a study of history, studied 27 civilizations. They all died, except Western civilization in the 1930s and early 40s when he was doing a study of history. Then came Petrum Sorokin's The Crisis of Our Age, with a timetable and the back of it of the death and demise of Western civilization. Not so much year by year, but event by event, phase by phase. And the end of it was when you would find Rembrandts on beer cans. We have long since passed through Rembrandts and beer cans. That happened in the 1960s. We have been wandering for 40 years, since 1968, in an increasing jungle, complicated now since 1991 by the ending of a time form. If we do not live dimensionally enough to raise our quality to 5 dimensions, there will not be a new culture, a planetary culture, not a global culture. If we do not raise it through the prism of a 6-dimensional conscious spiritual person, there will be no 7-dimensional kaleidoscopic conscious flow like history, which alone can bring a new time form into being on the level of a civilization. A civilization is largely a 7-dimensional activity. And if you try to approximate it through the 4-dimensional frames of reference of the mythic horizon of experience, it is inadequate. If you try to manipulate it through the 4-dimensional integral of mental structures, they are not only inadequate, they eventually do not work. They are, in the words of a great poem by Wallace Stevens, Asides on the Oboe, they are the false gods that time crumbles. We live in the ruins of something that has gone, and the de facto false responses have produced a regression. On one hand, a millennial regression. We're back in the Crusades. But it's also the change of an aeon, so it's an aeonic regression. We're back in the time of the corruption of the Roman Empire. But it also has reverberations. A millennium can look forward. And if we are creative and we look forward, the Hermetic wisdom shows that we will be able to look forward not just 1,000 years, but to that mediating 500 years, and its parallel 500 years beyond the millennium. But if the regression comes in, you have not only a millennial regression back to the Crusades, you have those 500-year periods. They were hermetically called Phoenix cycles, cycles of the Phoenix. You go back to 500 AD, which was the end of classical civilization, of reading, of learning, and back to 500 BC, before there was any kind of a beginning ecumenical sense of the different areas of the world being able to mature together. So we live in a multiple layered regression that accelerates. And by 2008, the acceleration is almost like a landslide. We have an opportunity in 2008 not just to turn a new page of American history, but in order to open up creatively the responses to a multiplicity of challenges that are like a tidal wave. Many sensitive people have sensed the tidal wave, not a 50 or 60-foot tidal wave, something taller than the tallest building, like half-mile wave. It is a paltry image because it's a tidal wave of a time form ending, which is planet-wide. It will eclipse the planet. This is the kind of a challenge that Hermetic America 300 years ago was conscious of and constantly took reassessment to, because by that time you had someone like a Benjamin Franklin who was able to encompass all of the classic levels. In the autobiography, one can find a very interesting analytic chart of 14 different characteristics of his personality, not his individual, not of individualism, but the spectrum of his personality, and to keep track of each of the 14 every day in sets of weeks, in sets of months, in sets of years. And one finds, when you come to his collected works, they've been trying to publish the collected works of Benjamin Franklin, Yale University Press. This was the original brochure, sponsored by Yale University and the American Philosophical Society, which he founded in Philadelphia, since the early 1950s. Let's see, volume 1, I believe, if I remember, came out about 1952, 53. It's still not finished publishing. It takes as long to publish it as it took Franklin to live it. The same thing for the collected works of Jefferson. They were started by Princeton around 1950. They are still just up to his presidency. This is unacceptable. This is volume 4. And if you turn in volume 4, which is one of the most interesting because it has his experiments and observations on electricity made at Philadelphia in America, published in London in 1751. But in this, there is a presentation on several pages of the idea of the English school. And this English school has a subtitle, A Sermon on Education, wherein some account is given of the academy established in the city of Philadelphia. Now, the academy of the city of Philadelphia became the University of Pennsylvania. It was founded by Benjamin Franklin, marshaling together a number of his friends, his fellow learners, in the dialogue prismed by books which they read together, discussed together. Franklin largely the leader because he not only was able to discuss the books and read the books, but he printed a lot of the major books. I'm old enough to have learned to set type in junior high school, in the 7th grade. When you were a printer of a book, you had to take each little lead letter and put it in a handheld tray and spell the word out from a big matrix of letters, and you used most of the letters like E, so they were bigger trays, but the biggest tray was a bar, and it was a blank piece of lead to give articulation to the words. Let's continue with Franklin, the idea of the English school, the development of the academy in the city of Philadelphia. And the reason for the academy was to have a place initially for George Whitefield to speak. George Whitefield is the founder of evangelical Christianity. He was the greatest preacher of all time. He died at age 55. He delivered over 18,000 sermons. Constantly. And someone once pointed out, he was determined to burn himself out for Jesus, and he did. He was English, but he lectured all over. England and Scotland together were called Great Britain, all over Great Britain and Wales. But especially in America, he came, I think, 7 or 8 times. One of his earliest friends was Benjamin Franklin. And because Whitefield in his charisma exceeded the bounds that the religious bureaucracies who controlled places like Boston and Philadelphia would allow. There was no place for him to speak to such large crowds except in the street. And very often he would have crowds of 6,000 to 10,000 people, sometimes 15,000 people, 300 years ago. In our time, the charismatic speaker who's very much a 20th century George Whitefield was Billy Graham. And if you go to downtown Los Angeles, right next to the Bureau of Traffic and everything, you'll find a plaque that Billy Graham delivered his first sermon here in downtown LA. George Whitefield was that kind of individual. And so Franklin, being a Hermetic American, got together a number of friends in Philadelphia to put up the funds to build a place where George Whitefield and all others like him could speak and not be dependent on the various denominations, on the various bureaucratic approvals. Because very often the approvals were not limited to the colony, but went overseas to England. And so if the English bureaucracies did not approve, they couldn't happen. And the communication would take months, and the waiting period sometimes years. And for religious things, very often, the King Georges deferred to the Archbishop of Canterbury, who did not like to encourage anyone not under control in the colonies having an expansion of horizons, especially in terms of religious vision. So the Academy of Philadelphia was engineered by Franklin to make a place where all viewpoints could be heard, including those about God, including those about religious experience and the experiences that exceeded the experiential frame of reference. And out of this academy came the University of Pennsylvania, one of the really great, phenomenal places. Whitefield also lectured at the college in Princetown that became Princeton, and many other original places. They moved an Indian school, which he lectured at in New England, which became so successful that the Indian school was moved to New Hampshire, and they found funding from a British noble, Lord Dartmouth. And so Dartmouth University was founded on the basis of this. This is a seed time of the Republic, as someone said. All of the great learning places in the United States were transforms of the need for oases that were not controlled by existing authorities or by the projected expectation that there will always be those seeking new authorities and new obediences. The crux of all of this in our time came in the decade of the 1960s, when it was apparent to those of us especially who had been students since the 50s in universities and now were beginning to teach in those universities. And what was given to you by 1967 was a cookie cutter template called the systems approach to teaching. You had to divide up your course. You had to divide up the presentations within the course according to the systems approach of education. And the trigger man for the systems approach of education was Simon Ramo, who with two other partners founded a company based on the initials of their last name, TRW. The R in TRW is Simon Ramo, and I will bring next week his books on the systematic authority, obedience, structure of education. Your credit reports are made by successors to TRW. One reason of going to Canada to design an interdisciplinary program in early 1970 was to sidestep that kind of limitation. At the same time that I was designing the course in Hermetic Renaissance in San Francisco, the History of Consciousness program at University of California, Santa Cruz was being engineered. When I finished 5 years of designing my program, which was running, which is the first prototype of what became 40 years later the learning civilization. In 1975, when I wrote to the head of the History of Consciousness program, Norman O. Brown, he said, don't bother coming. It's already gone. It's been co-opted by the bureaucracy of the University of California system, by the hierarchy of UC, Santa Cruz places, and everyone who was associated with this has either left the university or gone into specific departments. Page Smith went into history. Page Smith, whose big 18-volume history of the United States is one of the best ever done, whose poignant volumes we'll bring in later because he's really a Hermetic American. Norman O. Brown himself, whose great book in the 1960s at the beginning was Life Against Death, and then followed it up by a sequel called Love's Body, which was almost a iridescent implication that prismatic persons literally experience a love together and share their maturation. But his first book in 1947 as a young professor was Hermes the Thief, some of the origins of the Hermetic tradition. What you're being presented with here is such a labyrinthian complexity, but it works out in my ability to give you the presentations in a layered way, not in an ordered way, but in a layered way that builds like tree rings so that eventually one can come to understand how it is that reality actually occurs as real. I will bring next week one of the volumes of the writings of Jonathan Edwards. Edwards was born in 1703, and selections of Franklin and Edwards very often were put together. Here's the Modern Student's Library, Charles Scribner's Sons. It was a series, largely in little paperbacks like this, that gave the great philosophers in selections. Franklin and Edwards are put together by Carl Van Doren, who did a great 2-volume biography of Benjamin Franklin. The 25 volumes so far published by Yale, the collected works of Jonathan Edwards, are extraordinary. He was exemplary. He was one of the first students of Yale. And after 8 years of being there, they wanted him as a tutor. Then his grandfather, Solomon Stoddard, died, and his congregation in Northampton, Massachusetts, asked for Jonathan Edwards to come and take his grandfather's pulpit. And he was there for 23 years. Then he did some disapprovals of the bureaucracy of the church hierarchy that he began teaching that there is more to the expansion of the horizon of experience than just the simple rote presentations. And so the hierarchy of the congregation flicked him out of the office, locked him out of his parish, exiled him from his church, so that he was given the lowest possible position that a professional pastor could be given. He was given a little section of tutorials to do in an Indian college. And for 6 years, he was a low-paid instructor for Indians. He had a wife of 30 years, 12 children. But all that time, Edwards began to write some of the greatest classical early American books imaginable. And we'll take a look at some of those later on. One of the early writings was on the mind. And this is The Mind of Jonathan Edwards, a reconstructed text, Leon Howard, University of California Press. Another published by Yale and edited by Perry Miller, the great American history scholar on the Puritans, Images or Shadows of Divine Things. The forward-looking Hermetic American genius of someone like Edwards was about to take hold, because his books, his writings, which when they were read by a larger audience, realized the extraordinary genius of someone like Jonathan Edwards. And so he was sent for by the College of Princetown, that by that time had become Princeton. And he was invited to become the new president of Princeton University. At the time in Princeton, in the town, there was another reoccurring attack of smallpox. And a technique to combat smallpox had been pioneered in Boston in 1721 by Cotton Mather. It's called inoculation through a vaccination. Edwards arrived in Princeton, and within a couple of months, they decided that he needed to have an inoculation against the smallpox, and the inoculation got complicated by a secondary infection, and he died. He was 55 years of age, the same age as George Whitefield. And what would have been an incredible blossoming of early Princeton under Jonathan Edwards went by the boards. Quite often in Hermetic America, we will observe and see the limited, almost severely limited to the point of being crippled, of Hermetic Americans. We will see poets like Emily Dickinson, who almost never left Amherst, Massachusetts, and rarely left the house and that she lived in, and the house in a lot over next door, even though her brother was the head of Amherst College and one of the great figures in the state. In her lifetime, none of her several thousand poems were published. We will find again and again that by pulling out the quality of Hermetic Americans and arraying them in the full spectrum of their significance and layering in the way in which a tree ring would add to the tree, we'll be able to understand the significance of a natural history illustration in one of the early writings of Jonathan Edwards 250 years ago, where he used the images of trees in a forest, and that the trees come from little tiny seeds, and that those little tiny seeds have an infinite expansion of other trees through time, and that in the forest you never find two trees that are alike. They're always individual, but they're always recognized as trees. One of the really great Hermetic Americans was Ansel Adams. And my favorite photograph of Ansel Adams is of a pine forest after a fresh snowfall. That is all that is there, but the presence of what is there is all. And one sees, and I'll bring a reproduction of it. I have, as a birthday gift from my wife about 10 years ago, Ralph Lauren in Beverly Hills had a 6-foot by 7-foot blow-up of that photograph, and I was able to get that for my wife Nisa as a present. But I'll bring a smaller version of it. One sees in the quality of the Hermetic America forest the ability, like Thoreau said, I stand with the trees in the snowstorm so that this will occur with all the dimensions of me being with my friends. And then I am able to write it in my journals so that it can be read as long as men and women care to read together. More next week.